I knew exactly what I was getting into the day. I signed the papers for that rocky, overgrown patch of shoreline at the dead end of Blackwood Ridge, because when you spent 20 years as a custom builder, you learn to read a survey map like a priest reads a Bible, and this particular map told me something that felt better than winning the lottery. You see, the Copper Creek Homeowners Association, a group of people notorious for measuring the height of your grass with a literal ruler, had their jurisdiction end exactly 12 inches before my property line began, and I'd walked that boundary with a high-precision laser level and a thermos of coffee enough times to know that if I stood on my front porch and coughed, the HOA couldn't and oppose to even tell me to cover my mouth. My name is Elias Thorne. I'm 52, a man who's handled more divorce paperwork and blueprints than any one person should, and all I wanted was to build a sanctuary, a timber frame cabin where the only thing I had to answer to was the tide of the lake and the occasional curious hawk. I didn't oppose. T want a paved driveway. I didn't oppose. T want a synchronized mailbox. And I sure as hell didn't oppose. T want a board of directors telling me what shade of earth tone my window trim had to be, but apparently, living just outside the kingdom makes you a threat to the queen. The trouble didn't oppose. T just walk up to my door. It drove up in a pristine, white SUV that looked like it had never seen a gravel road in its life, and out stepped Margaret Vance, a woman whose hair was sprayed into a permanent, wind-defying helmet, and who wore an expression like she'd just found a slug in her organic kale salad. I was mid-swing with a sledgehammer, working on the forms for my foundation, when she marched onto the site, her heels sinking into the mud with every step, and she didn't oppose. To even say hello, she just pointed a manicured finger at my subfloor and told me I was in, gross violation, of the Copper Creek Aesthetic Charter. I just leaned on my hammer, wiped the sweat from my brow, and told her that unless the charter applied to international waters or sovereign territory, she was about 4 yards deep into a place where her opinion carried as much weight as a feather in a hurricane. Her face went from pale to a shade of pressurized beet red, her lips thinning until they nearly disappeared, and she told me that the visual integrity, of the lakefront was a collective responsibility and that I'd be hearing from their legal counsel before the concrete even had time to cure. I just smiled, pulled a copy of the county certified survey out of my back pocket, the one with the bright red non-HOA stamp, and told her to make sure her lawyer brought his own boots, because the mud on my side of the line was a lot deeper than it looked. I figured that would be the end of the posturing, a simple case of a neighborhood bully realizing she'd picked a fight with someone who actually knew the law. But people like Margaret Dawn and Oppos, just go away, they simmer, and 3 days later, a certified packet arrived that was thick enough to be a novel. It was a formal notice of aesthetic encroachment, from a high-priced firm in the city, claiming that because my lot shared a, visual corridor, with the Copper Creek community, I was subject to their architectural review board, a claim so legally flimsy, I actually laughed while reading it over a beer. But then things started getting weird, and I don and oppos. Mean just annoying neighbor, weird, organized surveillance, weird because I'd be up on a ladder, nailing down cedar siding, and I'd see a man in a neon vest standing on the public access path with a pair of binoculars, or a drone would buzz over my roof at 6 in the morning, waking me up before the sun even hit the trees. I decided to call in some backup, not a lawyer yet, but my old friend Silas, a retired park ranger who's about as easygoing as a grizzly bear with a toothache, and we spent a Saturday afternoon installing a ring of high-definition trail cameras hidden in the pines, because I've learned that the best way to deal with ghosts is to turn on the lights. The real war started on a Tuesday night, a damp, foggy evening when the lake was so still it looked like glass, and I was sitting in my temporary trailer, sketching out the kitchen island, when I heard the unmistakable metallic snap of a bolt cutter coming from the direction of my power shed. I didn't oppose. I didn't oppose. Turn on a porch light. I just grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight and moved through the woods like I was back in Scouts, and what I found was a man named Miller, a guy who served as the HOA's grounds liaison, kneeling in the dirt and trying to sever the main line to my construction trailer. When I clicked that light on, he jumped so hard he nearly took his own finger off. I just stood there, recording the whole thing on my phone, watching him stammer about safety inspections, and unauthorized electrical hazards, I told him he had exactly 60 seconds to get off my land before I let the county sheriff explain the difference between a safety inspection and felony property damage, and he scrambled away into the darkness, leaving his expensive bolt cutters behind in the mud. I didn't oppose. He just filed a police report the next morning. I went to see my attorney, a woman named Sarah who specializes in land use litigation and who has a smile that makes most men want to confess to crimes they didn't oppose to even commit. Sarah looked at the footage, looked at the HOA's letters, and then she looked at me with a glint in her eye that told me Margaret Vance had just made the biggest mistake of her life because it wasn't oppose to just about a power line anymore. We filed a discovery motion as part of a harassment suit, and when the court granted us access to the Copper Creek HOA's internal server, the floodgates didn't oppose to just open. They burst, revealing a trail of emails that looked more like a mob conspiracy than a neighborhood committee. Margaret had been coordinating a, denial of service, campaign, instructing the local lumber yard to delay my deliveries, whispering to the county building inspector that I was dumping gray water into the lake, and even discussing how to, incentivize, my departure by making the construction process as expensive as possible. But the real, smoking gun, was a set of documents showing that the HOA had created a shell company, a fake environmental nonprofit, to lobby the county to rezone my specific lot as a, protected wetland, which would have effectively frozen my building permit forever. It was a calculated, cold-blooded attempt to steal the value of my land through bureaucratic strangulation, and the best part was that they'd used HOA dues, money paid by my neighbors, to fund the whole illegal operation. The day of the preliminary hearing was one of those crisp, bright autumn mornings where everything feels sharp and clear, and I sat in the back of the courtroom watching Margaret and her legal team whisper frantically as Sarah laid out the timeline of events. The judge was a man who looked like he'd seen every petty squabble in the county, but as Sarah played the video of Miller cutting my power line and then transitioned into the email showing the board's plan to, bankrupt the interloper, his expression shifted from bored to visibly disgusted. He didn't oppose. He just grant us the injunction. He referred the board's actions to the district attorney for a criminal inquiry into conspiracy and fraud, and the look on Margaret's face, the way her jaw dropped as the reality of a felony investigation set in, was worth every penny I'd spent on cedar and stone. Within a month, the Copper Creek HOA was in a total tailspin. The board members were resigning one by one to avoid being caught in the blast radius, and the neighborhood itself was in revolt, realizing their, pristine, community was being run by a group of people who were playing fast and loose with the law and the residents in oppose money. But I wasn't oppose done, because I've always believed that if you're going to clear a field, you have to pull the stumps too. So I waited until the cabin was finished, a beautiful, soaring structure of honey-colored wood and glass that stood as a silent middle finger to everyone who said I couldn't oppose build it. I invited the entire neighborhood over for an open house, even the ones who had glared at me from across the line, and I stood on my deck and told them exactly what their leadership had been doing behind closed doors. I showed them the ledgers, the emails, and the wetland scheme, and I watched as the anger shifted from me to the people in the white SUVs, and by the end of the night, we weren't oppose just neighbors, we were a jury. Margaret ended up moving away before the trial even started. Her house sold at a loss just to escape the shame of the community she'd tried to, protect, and the HOA itself was eventually dissolved and replaced by a simple, road maintenance agreement, that had no power to tell anyone what color their front door could be. Now, I sit on my porch as the sun sets over the water, listening to the crickets and the soft lap of the lake against the rocks, and I think about how close I came to just giving up and moving somewhere else. But that's the thing about boundaries. They only work if you're willing to defend them. And sometimes the only way to get people to respect your space is to show them that you're willing to burn theirs down to the ground, legally speaking, of course. My cabin is finally the sanctuary I dreamed of, and every time I look at that 12-inch gap between my land and the old Copper Creek line, I can't help but chuckle at the absurdity of it all. I've even kept those bolt cutters I found in the mud. I had them chrome-plated and mounted over my fireplace as a reminder that some walls are built with wood, but the strongest ones are built with the truth. So, I have to ask you, if you found out your community was being run by people who thought they were above the law, would you keep your head down to keep the peace, or would you be the one to light the match? Because at the end of the day, a home ISN and oppos. T just where you live. It's what you're willing to fight for. And I'd love to hear your stories of standing your ground in the comments below. Because sometimes the only way to deal with a bully is to let them know they've finally met someone who doesn't and oppos. T mind getting a little mud on their boots.